students of Medinipur College, and also Tanmoy, whom I love very much as a junior colleague of mine, and I
And,
can.
and sir, one more information I like to share with my students that Angshumanda is my college senior. Though I was when I admitted to JK College in 2004, so that time he was he is now also at Badwan University. Angshumanda is my senior. He has passed out from JK College Purulia. So that relationship is
That
also there.
relationship is also.
Thank you, Dada. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, Tanma, it's always there, and that's why it's become impossible for me to say no to you, right? Whenever any request comes from you, I always say, okay, Tanma, I will do it for you, right? Anyway, so let me tell you that, yeah, but you could have been my student also, because in 2001 I joined Jhargram Government College as a lecturer. At that time the post was called the post of a lecturer, and then in 2002 I shifted to Bardwan University. Anyway, forget about all those things. Let us come straight to the business. Look, I'm going to basically, though Torma has told you that I'm going to talk about Marxism in general, but that I'm not going to do, because that is almost impossible for me to do in 1 hour or so. Uh, Instead, what I have decided to do is to engage myself deeply with that essay of Althusser, which is prescribed in your syllabus. That is the ideological state apparatuses and RSA. So that essay, because this is something which contains, some of the basic uh, insights of Althusser's theories. And the essay is titled Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, Notes Towards an Investigation. This is something very important, because almost all the important, though he defined ideology in an earlier work, but this essay has become, a kind of a seminal one, representative of Althusser's ideas and thoughts, because this is where he categorically uh, discusses RSA and ISAs, talks about the differences between these two, and also very clearly, uh, I would say, reinterprets ideology. And also he here introduces a new term, which also has become a kind of a key concepts, one of the key concepts of Althusser's theories, and that is interpellation, right? So basically I'll be talking about all these issues in today's class, and it's a talk which is meant for the students exclusively. Now, let me tell you that I hope you all know that uh, this essay was published in 1970. In fact, even before that, from the 1916, mid 1916, 60s, I mean, Althusser started talking about so many other things, started writing about so many other things. And I hope you also know that he had a very, what I should say, controversial career as well. He was a member of the French Communist Party, but towards the fag end of his life, things really became very complicated for him. He killed his own wife and went through even, treatment under a psychiatrist. So the history of Althusser's life is also a bit complicated, and so are some of his thoughts and ideas as well. But we are not interested that much in the personal life of Althusser, because that won't help us much in unlocking his ideas. What we should rather keep in mind is the time frame when he appeared as a Marxist. That was the peak of what we can call post-structuralist thoughts, right? Because in the 1960s, if you can remember, uh, Derrida published most of his seminal works, Structure, Sign, blah, blah, blah. Barth, Foucault, Lacan. So that's why, as I've told you, that this is something which we should keep in mind, that exactly at that time, uh, Althusser was writing. And this is important for me because some of the later theoreticians, they have tried to consider Althusser as a structuralist Marxist, right? In fact, some have even argued that Marxism is also nothing other than a form of structuralism because it also talks about structures. But if you ask for my opinion, I'll tell you that yes, Marxism talks about structures, but the structures in Marxism are not at all atemporal as spatial structures. Rather, they are very much time and space bound. So, Marxism, in that sense, does not talk about universal structures. Sorry about this persistent cough. So that is a kind of a borderline, or rather thin borderline, that we should keep in mind while talking about Marxism and structuralism. In fact, let me also tell you that I don't think that Althusser should be considered a structuralist Marxist because of so many reasons. Why, I'll tell you gradually later on. I would rather like to argue that Althusser, this is my take, exclusively my take on Althusser, that Althusser was trying to rescue Marxism from the hands of whom I would like to call vulgar Marxists. And he was also trying to probably, not by making explicit statements, but was trying to probably prove the importance of Marxism, even in the context of the rise of post-structuralist thoughts, and was trying to negotiate with some of the basic ideas of post-structuralism. Why I am telling you this, I hope at the end of my class, this will be clear to you. Now, to go back to that context, that Althusser was trying to, in a way, reinterpret Marxism. And as I've told you, that I think that he was trying to rescue Marxism from the hands of the vulgar Marxists. Why? Because Marxism was interpreted by them. Sometimes what happens, বাবু যত বলে পারিষদ দলে বলে তার শতগুণ, Rabindranath wrote. So this happens, and that's why what was said by Marx and Engels was not um, interpreted in the ways those thoughts should have been interpreted. And some of their blind followers even went one step further to misinterpret them. For instance, one of the charges that has been brought against Marxism is that it's a very simplistic way of understanding the complexities of, or the complex structures of society. Why? Because it is governed by what is known as technically economic over determinism, right? What does it mean? In order to understand this, we need to go back to Marx and Engels conception of society as we find it in the famous book, The German Ideology, that was published probably in the year 1846, 2 years before the publication of the famous The Communist Manifesto, right? So this is something which is very important. Very important. Why? Because this is basically an architectural metaphor that was used by Marx and Engels to interpret the structure of society. And they say it that if we look at the German ideology and some other works of Marx and Engels as well, that production relations actually constitute the base of society, and almost everything else that you find around yourself, for instance, the legal structure, religion, culture, media, all these things constitute the superstructure. It's an architectural metaphor because we can think in terms of the structure of a house, a building, where the base is at the bottom and the floors are standing on the base. If you look at the writings of Marx and Engels, they made it clear that the superstructure is not determined by the base, but it stands upon the base, rests upon the base. Now, this is something which is very important. Meaning, they were trying to argue that without the base, you cannot have the superstructure. But that doesn't mean that the superstructure is not at all important here, and everything is determined by the base. Everything is determined by the production relations. Now, loosely speaking, production relations, this phrase could be substituted by economics, and that is what is done. And that is why I was talking about economic over determinism. That base is economics, according to Marx and Engels. This is where their theory got reduced to. And this is, as I've told you, an absolute wrong way of understanding them. In fact, if you read one of the letters of Friedrich Engels, which he wrote to one of his friends, Joseph Bloch, you can have an excerpt from this letter in Terry Eagleton's one of the books of Terry Eagleton on Marxism. There he has quoted, from this letter of Engels, where Engels clearly said that this is not what we meant. Actually, we meant that ultimately base is all. Now, this is something which is very important. Ultimately base is all. What does it mean? It means that base is not the only important thing in this model, but it is the ultimate thing. It's not the only thing, only important thing, which means the superstructure also has some importance, right? A lot of importance, actually. But ultimately, base is all. Why? Because if you think in terms of that architectural metaphor, as I've told you already, if you remove the base, without the base, you cannot have the superstructure. The superstructure cannot hang in the air. It needs a platform to rest upon. And that platform is base, a world of production relations, simplified as economics. So my point is that if you read Marx and Engels in original and the way they responded to the debates that came up while interpreting their writings, you'll find that, particularly Engels, he was very clear about this later on. You'll find that they never made this model to be a one-dimensional model, a one-way traffic. Rather, it was a two-dimensional model, two-way traffic. But the model lost its importance because of misinterpretation, because of what the, as I have used the term vulgar Marxist, what the vulgar Marxist they did with this model. It was Althusser who, from the mid 1960s onward, started reinterpreting this model, I should say, in a Marxist way, and started also adding a few things to the existing Marxist paradigm of thought. It was almost a kind of an epistemological contribution on his part. That also is something that I'll definitely underline. But having said so, let me once again very firmly declare that I do not consider Althusser to be either a revisionist or a post Marxist, in the sense sometimes Foucault or Derrida, they are called post Marxists. Rather, to me, Althusser is ultimately a Marxist who was trying to rescue Marxism on the one hand from the hands of vulgar Marxists. On the other hand, he was trying to prove the importance of Marxism in the context of the rise of post-structuralist thoughts and postmodernism, which negated, rejected any form of grand narrative which Marxism was thought to be. And also at the same time, he tried to negotiate with some of the basic insights of post-structuralism. This is how I look at Althusser. Why? I'll tell you gradually. Now, this is more or less as a kind of an introduction to Althusser and to some of the basic, very basic notions of Marxism that I wanted to give you, share with you some of my ideas. Now, if we come to this particular essay, which is prescribed in your syllabus, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, Notes Towards an Investigation, this is something which is Althussers' contribution, particularly the formation of the idea of ideological state apparatuses. Now, those of you who have read the essay, or those of you who will read the essay, they will find that, for those of you who have read, they already know it, that there are certain sub-titles in this essay, and Althusser moves in a very systemic way from one subtitle to another by explaining what happens. Now, another thing, let me here tell you, this is a point that I forgot to talk about in the introductory part, and that is that though when Althusser was writing this essay, USSR was a reality, but still capitalism was reigning almost the entire world, was dominating the entire world, and that is true even today. So Althusser, while writing this essay, was also in search of an answer to this question, that why is capitalism dominating the entire world so much? How is it possible? He was trying to find out an answer to this question as well. This is why sometimes some people have said that in Althusser, there is no solution to the problems that he discusses. He keeps himself limited to an analysis of how capitalism works through ideology and fails to go beyond that, fails to give a clarion call like that one, which we get at the end of the Communist Manifesto: workers of the world unite. No call like this one we get in Althusser. Concept of revolution in that way. is also absent in this essay, and that is something which analysis, very in-depth, insightful, theoretical analysis we do have. One of the reasons for this, as I told you, was perhaps the fact that Althusser was trying to understand the reasons for the rise of capitalism and the kind of hegemony that it was creating. I'm using the word hegemony deliberately by referring to Gramsci, and that is something which Althusser will also be doing. One last thing also, let me tell you before I enter into the essay, is that Althusser, while writing this essay, was also indebted to Freud, to psychoanalysis, in fact, to Freud, and also to Lacan to a great extent. Why I'll definitely try to show or prove before you. Now let us come back to the essay. This essay is basically about how, if I am to sum up the essence of the essay in one sentence, then this essay is basically about how capitalism uses ideology to reproduce itself. This is the basic insight which Althusser works on in a very systemic way, step by step movement we can trace regarding this. And that's why the first thing that he writes on in this essay is he writes on the reproduction of the conditions of production. The section is titled this, Reproduction of the Conditions of Production. Conditions of production, this is how capitalism reproduces itself. Conditions of production need to be reproduced for the survival of capitalism. Meaning, a worker who comes to the factory gate if he or she becomes aware of his or her exploitation, that the factory is a site of exploitation, that this is where I am being exploited and capital is being formed by exploiting me, then he won't come back to the gate of the factory the next day. But that usually does not happen. Sometimes we do have what you call hartals, right? Bunds. But usually the wheels of a factory run. They don't stop. How and why? Because Althusser argues, and this is one of the basic fundamental premises of Marxism, that the conditions of production are reproduced each day, every day. Now, what does this mean? Althusser here talks about two things. If you look at the essay, the reproduction, capitalism must reproduce two things. One, the productive forces, the reproduction of the productive forces. And two, the existing relations of production. Two things need to be reproduced according to Althusser. He is explaining Marx actually. One, I repeat once again, capitalism must reproduce the productive forces. And it must also reproduce the existing relations of production. That is also something very, very important. Now, what do you mean by the productive forces? Let me just read out a portion from the essay. A moment's reflection is enough to be convinced of this. Mr. X, a capitalist who produces woolen yarn in his spinning mill, has to within quotes, reproduce his raw materials, his machines, etc. But he does not produce them for his own production. Other capitalists do. An Australian sheep farmer, Mr. Y, a heavy engineer producing machine tools, Mr. Z, etc., etc. And Mr. Y and Mr. Z, in order to produce those products, which are the condition of the reproduction of Mr. X's conditions of production, also have to reproduce the conditions of their own production, and so on to infinity. He's talking about a chain, Althusser, actually. Talking about a chain. Meaning, for instance, let me give you, he has given us the example of woolen yarn. Let us talk about a car factory, a factory that produces four-wheelers. Do you think that all the raw materials which are used for producing a car are produced within that factory itself? No. That's why in Bangla there is a term called Onusari Shilpo. So many other industries are there which keep on supplying raw materials to the production of a car. So these are part of the productive forces, and you must reproduce all these things. Meaning, if a factory, say, that produces cars does not get screws, right, or even water, or even the wheels of the car, for instance, JK Tire, MRF, they produce tires. It's not the car factory that produces. Car factories are Maruti Suzuki, Tata Motors, right? So they are not producing the tires. But without the tires, you cannot produce a car. So one capitalist is dependent on another. That capitalist who is producing tire is dependent on so many others for the production of raw materials, or rather the reproduction of the raw materials. And all these things need to be reproduced continuously like a chain. Otherwise, the system will collapse. So the raw materials, productive forces. Within the productive forces, there is also another very important thing, and that is the labor power. Very simple. Suppose you produce cars and you have all the raw materials ready. Other capitalists are continuously reproducing all those things, reproducing their own conditions of production, and as a result of that, they are supplying the raw materials that you need to produce a car. But you don't have laborers in your factory, the human hands. It's not possible to depend on machines exclusively. And that's why I raised that issue in the beginning, that the laborers must come back to the gate of the factory the next day. They must. They ought to be brought to the factory gate each and every day in the morning. That is the responsibility of the capitalist. And that will ensure the smooth running of the system of capitalism. Now, how does this happen? How does this happen? So many means Althusser has talked about. The laborers are given wages using which they can maintain their families, take care of the education of the children, salary basically. Though that is far less than the ideal, and this is how capital is born. I hope you know that. I'm not going into the details of the production of capital and exploitation of the laborers. He has also talked about biologically guaranteed minimum wage and historically variable minimum. I'm not going to explain that as well. He has talked about the need for the production of skills of the laborers. This is something very important. A skilled laborer is an asset to a capitalist in comparison to an unskilled laborer. And that's why, if you look at all these educational institutes, polytechnic colleges, IITs, engineering colleges, and even what we are now doing, other educational institutions, they produce basically skilled laborers to be used in the system of capitalism in different spheres. We also keep on producing as a skilled laborer who could be used in, say, different media houses, newspaper companies, IT sectors, and even in the educational sector, which has also become now a very lucrative market for the capitalists. We keep on producing, even in our colleges and universities, laborers who would be of use in the capitalist system, right? And not only the know-hows, techniques are important, but also another thing is important, that often the skills are produced not within the factory. Sometimes we know that there are a few factories where what we call apprenticeship, right? I mean, you work as an apprentice and you learn a few skills as an apprentice. Such provisions are there, but these provisions are not always available. Mostly these skills are produced outside the factory, in schools, colleges, other institutions. And also at the same time, there is a moral side of this skill production. That's why so many of you had a paper called moral science in your school curriculum, what to do and what not to do. Because ultimately you'll have to be a very good servant, obedient servant in the capitalist system, whether you are a man who runs a machine, a welding machine, say for instance, or whether you are a manager or you are a CEO. Different posts require different skills, but the bottom line is the same. You need to carry out obediently the orders of your immediate seniors. And this is something which is very, very important. This is what Althusser says, the reproduction of productive forces. And this is where also existing relations of production become very, very important. And this is where, particularly when I'm talking about the fourth point, in the context of the production of the skill, the fourth point, in that context, particularly, remember that ideology becomes important. And the function of the ideological state apparatuses, that becomes very, very important and significant. So the first part of my talk is over. Tanmoy, I would like to take a few questions from the students from because now I'll enter into something which is a bit more complicated than this. Whether the basic thing is clear to them or not regarding whatever we have discussed so far, let me just cross-check that and then I'll move forward. So students, you are free to interact with me, and I would also request you to turn on your video so that I can have the feel that I am talking to a human being and not to a machine, right? If you have any queries, please feel free to ask me regarding whatever we have done so far. What is the intention of Althusser in writing this essay? How should we look at him? And what does he say about the reproduction of the production relations?
Hello, sir. Sir, I am Ashish Naik. Sir, you
Will it be if it's an encroachment upon your privacy, then
no, sir.
I don't say anything. Otherwise, it's better
No,
if
sir.
you
The
turn on.
internet
So
connection
I
is
can
very poor
I can
here.
I can have a sense that I feel that I'm talking to a human being, as I told you, while interacting. This is something which kind of give this gives us a kind of a kick actually. Ashish, please.
Sir, I am not prepared. Okay, I will do next time, sir.
Okay,
Sir,
fine.
sir, you mentioned Louis Althusser wanted to rescue Marxism from the vulgar Marxists. Sir,
Hmm.
I don't have any idea about vulgar Marxism and who are the practitioners of this school of thought. Sir.
Meaning, if you just look at, let me just give you one example. So many. I don't want to drop names only. Just let me tell you that those uh, who could not understand Marx and Engels' writings properly and misinterpreted them and reduced Marxism as a philosophical discourse to to I should say a kind of a very narrow space, right? Something as reduced it as something very strict, very simplistic and very narrow, which fails to accommodate the larger issues of society and the real complexities of society. If you, for instance, in the domain of literature, since we are students of literature, if you read the writings of who are known as the socialist realists, who dominated the literary scene in Stalin's USSR, right? They were headed by someone whose name was Karl Radek, who wrote a very famous essay, James Joyce or Socialist Realism, something like that is the title of the essay. I'm actually pointing out these people. And even now, there are so many people who think that whatever was said by Marx and Engels, they are like the words of the Vedas, should not be altered at all. Marxism basically is a philosophy about change. It's something dynamic. Dialectical materialism is not at all something which is static. The very word, dialectics involves a kind of dynamism and not stasis at all. So many could be named, but the point which is important is that that's why I've called them vulgar Marxists, that they in a way, to some extent, vulgarized Marxism, right? Made it look very vulgar, which it is not. To me, it's a very sophisticated and refined Marxism as a discourse. And it was so to Louis Althusser as well. I hope I'm clear to you now, Ashish.
So, sir, we can also consider Louis Althusser as a vulgar Marxist.
My God, why? He tried to rescue Marxism from the hands of the vulgar Marxist, and you were saying that. Do you know the meaning of
Yes,
the word rescue? What does it mean?
yes, sir, definitely. But some things are can be some things can be questioned on his ideology, sir, because he actually communicated Marxism with structuralism. So from that point of view, I have.
No, 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 no. Have you read Althusser? I'm not getting your question. What exactly you are trying to ask me? It's not very clear to me. I have told you that this is not my take on Althusser. I don't think that he should be read as a structuralist Marxist. This is also a point that I made or tried to make in the beginning of my talk. Very clear. He's read
Sir,
times as a structuralist Marxist, but I don't think that he should be read in that way. I have my own reasons to defend my argument as well. I'll talk about those reasons. We'll have to wait for that.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Anything else?
Sir, according to Marx, you have mentioned base is economics. Sir, how does base actually influence superstructure?
No, look, this is a question which is a fundamental thing, and a class on Althusser is not supposed to give an answer to this question. It will take once again 30 minutes. I'll have to talk about his notion of alienation and production conditions. Basic thing is that any change in base, any change in the world of economics affects the superstructure. For instance, let me give you a very just one example. I hope that would suffice. Suppose, think of India, open economy policy, Mukto Bajar Orthaniti, that began with Manmohan Singh, if I'm not wrong, in 1991, when he was the finance minister of India, not the prime minister. It changed everything. The foreign companies started penetrating India, started investing in our country, producing things. Had it not been so, had the gates not been opened, the cultural practices in which now you are born and with which you grow up would have been different. Our childhood in the 1980s was distinctly different. It is distinctly different from your childhood that you spent in the beginning of the new millennium. Am I clear to you? This happened because of the change in the economic policy, world of economy, right? Your cultural practices, your eating habits change as a direct result of the change in the domain of economics.
Okay, sir. Fine.
পিৎজা, কেএফসি এসব আমরা ছোটবেলায় শুনিনি গো। শীতকাল মানে পিঠেপুলির জগৎ। বারবি ডল কাকে বলে আমরা জানতাম না ছোটবেলায়। এতগুলো বিদেশি ব্র্যান্ডের ঘড়ি, জামা কাপড় ছিল না আমাদের ছোটবেলায়। বুঝতে পারলেন না আশিস?
হ্যাঁ স্যার, একদম একদম।
Anything else? So should I move on to the next issue? This cough, I don't have COVID, but I have taken the precautionary dose, and on that day I met with an accident, and after that I got so much exposed to cold that this cough is troubling me a lot. Sorry about this. আর কারো কোনো প্রশ্ন আছে কি? Anything else? Otherwise I'll move on to the next segment of the essay. একজনকে অন্তত বলো যে বুঝেছি, নইলে তো এটা তো একটা থিওরিটিক্যাল আলোচনা না, আমার পক্ষে একটু
হ্যাঁ স্যার, প্লিজ পরে
তুমি বললে হবে না আশিস। I have understood that you have understood. What about the others? কারোর কিছুই বলার নেই?
আছে, পরের গুলো বলুন।
ঠিক আছে, thank you. So now the second issue, which is important in the issue of base and superstructure, or what is also known as infrastructure and superstructure. This is where Althusser actually reinterprets Marx and Engels and tries to look at it from a different angle as well. As I've told you that base and superstructure, this is not at all a one-dimensional model. At least it was not meant to be so by Marx and Engels. And I have also referred to that essay of, that letter of Friedrich Engels, which he wrote to one of his friends, where he clearly said that base is the ultimate thing, but not the only thing. Right? What does it mean? It means, and this is something that Althusser says, that superstructure has, the elements of superstructure, they do have a relative autonomy. This is a phrase which is very interesting, and you need to understand this very clearly. Two very significant statements Althusser makes in this segment. Let me just read out these two things. One, there is a relative autonomy of the superstructure with respect to the base. Two, I'm reading out from the essay. Two, there is a reciprocal action of the superstructure on the base. Both I have talked about. Two-way traffic, reciprocal action, meaning it's not only the base which influences the superstructure, but the superstructure can also influence the base. That is true. If your cultural practices change, those changes will have an impact on the world of productions, economy of your country. As simple as that. The example that I usually give to my students is the example of the 9/11 attack of 2001 in the US. The Twin Towers were attacked not at the base, but almost on the top. Superstructure collapsed. If you disturb the base, bhumikampa, earthquake, building collapses. If you attack a high-rising building on the top, it might also collapse. Two-way traffic. And as I've told you, that a cultural practice, which is a part of the superstructure, does have a change in that domain, does have an impact on the superstructure. And they are relatively autonomous also. So this is the reciprocality of action that Althusser talks about. What about autonomy? I once again give a very, very, you might call it a silly example to my students for making them understand this point. If you think of, say, a high-rising building, and Althusser has used this word also, floors, levels. In society, he talks about different levels or different floors, which is also something which is not exactly what was said by Marx and Engels. And this is how he keeps on slowly, slightly deviating from Marxism and proving his worth as a thinker who is trying to add something to the existing paradigm of Marxism, which is also something very important, right? So the thing that I was telling you, that if you want to, say, come down from the 4th floor to the 2nd floor of a high-rising building, do you need to go down to the base of that building? No. The lift will straight away bring you down from 4th to the 2nd floor. Possible. Which means that bypassing the base, one floor can interact with another. Which means that bypassing the base, one of the elements of the superstructure can interact with another element of the superstructure. They are relatively autonomous, not exclusively, not absolutely autonomous. Look at the use of the word relatively by Althusser, how meticulous he is about this. There is a relative autonomy, but they are not absolutely autonomous, because if you don't have the base, they don't exist, these floors, as was said by Engels. That base is the ultimate thing, but not the only important thing here. cultural practices. Let me give you a concrete example to make you understand that why I'm talking about coming down from fourth floor to second floor, ignoring the base or bypassing the base. Let me give you a concrete example. What is that? LGBT movement, right? With which you are all familiar with in India. When we were children, even some 10 years back, it was unthinkable for us. When I decided to teach one of the plays of Mahesh Dattani on a Magi night in Mumbai at the PG level, it was very difficult for me to teach such a text, which is explicitly a gay text. But now it's no more a problem at all because of the changes which have taken place in the socio-cultural fabric of our country. Still, homophobia is there, but at least Supreme Court has passed a verdict in this regard. So now, if we identify culture as one of the floors of the superstructure or as one of the elements of the superstructure, then we find that law, the legal domain, is another domain. And look at here, one movement or social texture, if we call this another form, then a movement or a change in the socio-cultural texture is having an impact on the legal structure, which means one element of the ideology, superstructure, is having an impact on another relatively autonomous. This was said by Marx and Engels. But remember, this is where I have told you that I find that probably these were all the influences of the post-structuralist stuff that Althusser was reading at the time. And that's why he was so different from all other Marxists, thinkers who wrote after Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Because post-structuralism basically talks about a kind of a centerlessness. And when Althusser is talking about the different floors and the levels, and he's also reinterpreting and highlighting, the issue that it's a two-way traffic that we have in this model offered by Marx and Engels, and the superstructure or the elements of superstructure are relatively autonomous. He too is, in a way, suggesting that the center of this model, which was thought to be the center of this model, that is economy, is not that central to this model. It is important, but it's not the only thing. He is almost challenging the centrality of economics in this model, which I would like to argue was almost, if not the impact of post-structuralism on Althusser, at least it was a kind of a negotiation of Marxism with post-structuralism. This is another segment which I have discussed, how Althusser reinterprets base and superstructure, and why I am arguing that I would not call him a structuralist Marxist. Rather, I would like to consider him as someone who was negotiating with some of the post-structuralist insights. Is it clear to you or not?
Yes, sir.
Ashish, partly I have been able to give the answer to the other question that you have put, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I was
Yes.
thinking about that.
Rupam, you are trying to say something, and then Shubhadeep, please. Rupam, you are trying to say something. Is it possible is it possible for you to switch on the video so that I can have a feel that I'm not talking to a salute? But yes, Rupam, thank you so much. Bolo, ki bolte chaichile? Unmute yourself, please. If you want to interact with me, now you can.
না স্যার বললাম বোঝা গেছে স্যার।
আচ্ছা, থ্যাংক ইউ। শুভদীপ,
ওটাই বলছিলাম যে বোঝা গেছে।
বোঝা গেছে। So let me now move on to the next part of this, which is titled Descriptive Theory to Theory as Such. Rupam, you can switch off your video if you want to, right? Because it consumes a lot of data, I know that. সারা সন্ধ্যা হয়তো ফেসবুক করতে হবে, তাই না রূপম? So you need to save your data. Thank you.
না স্যার ওরকম।
আরে I was joking.
Okay.
So the next part of the essay is titled From Descriptive Theory to Theory as Such. What does it mean? Now here Althusser says that he's trying to advance Marxism as a theory. And he says that Marxism has remained in a descriptive stage. What does it mean? And what is the difference between what he calls descriptive theory and theory as such? What is the basic difference between these two? Very interesting. He says that descriptive theory is a theory which is the first phase of any theory, even in case of any scientific theory. Meaning it's a theoretical discovery that could be applied to a set of similar situations to explain one particular thing. For instance, based on superstructure model or something that we have talked about so far, right? You can definitely apply this to a lot of historical situations to explain why such and such things actually happened in history. Descriptive theory. But he says that look at science, Althusser says. In science, the beginning of theory is this, but mere application of a theory to a practical situation does not make it theory as such, does not advance that theory. Advancement is needed. If you think of Newton, what Newton said is true. But did physics stop with Newton? Or works on gravitational forces? Has it stopped with Newton? Or has it moved forward? Even Einstein, such a great scientist, theory of relativity. What about astrophysics? Now, so the point is that you need to advance the theory. And Althusser says that there is nothing wrong for a theory to begin its journey with a descriptive stage. Every theory begins with this stage. But then in order to become a theory proper, theory as such, it advances itself in such a way, or other theoreticians who follow up the founder of that school, they work in such a way that the theory gets advanced and becomes a... When we talk about physics, remember that we don't only talk about Sir Isaac Newton anymore. Had it been so, then physics would have also remained in the state of gravitational experiments or theories have also remained in the state of descriptive theory, which unfortunately has happened with Marxism, Althusser says. Nobody has tried to advance Marxism as a theory. Application. a kind of what I call a kind of, almost we can say a kind of, this is Guruvad in Marxism, which is dangerous because Marx didn't believe in any kind of Guruvad. To some, Marx, even today in our country, is almost as important as is a religious guru, which is something funny. And if you consider someone as your guru, you fail to engage yourself in a kind of an intellectual debate with that man, and you lack the courage of challenging him or her and contradicting him or her if needed. Unfortunately, this has happened with Marxism, according to Althusser, and that's why there has been no advancement. Marxism has remained in the state of descriptive theory. And he says that I would like to advance Marxism as a theory and try to make Marxism theory as such by advancing it, by promoting it from the state of descriptive theory to the state of theory as such. And this is where he talks about the state ideological apparatuses. State ideological apparatuses. Right. Before that, he once again reiterates one of the basic fundamental beliefs of Marxism, that state is repressive. State has to be repressive, according to Marx and Engels, and that's why they dreamt of a classless, stateless society. State is always repressive. In fact, this is where he very significantly makes a distinction between state power and state apparatus, because he is going to talk about different state apparatuses. For understanding this, also a little bit of fundamental knowledge of Marxism you must have. Let me just read out once again a few lines from that section of the essay. He writes, as I told you, that very significantly he distinguishes between state power and state apparatus. He writes, the first clarification obliges me to distinguish between state power, within brackets, conservation of state power or seizure of state power, bracket closed, the objective of the political class struggle on the one hand and the state apparatus on the other. So they are not the same. They are not the same. State power and state apparatus. What is the difference? What is the difference? In the next sentence, Althusser writes, we know that state apparatus may survive, as is proved by the bourgeois revolutions in the 19th century France. What does it mean? Let me give you an example from our electoral politics. State power, Althusser writes, conservation of state power or seizure of state power. It can happen in both ways. Conservation or seizure. Meaning if the existing ruling party keeps the power, state power, in possession, then this is a kind of a conservation. Usually it happens in democracies through election. One political party holds the power, the state power, right? It could be seized as well. That's why so many times we find coup. Look at the history of Pakistan, so many coups. Military rising, right? And the power is seized. In Bangladesh, that also happened. India is relatively, you know, at least we should say we are more democratic. We have so many loopholes in our democracy, but other than the emergency, election, whether you like it or not, has been more or less a kind of a regular phenomenon in India, and the masses, they have given their verdict also clearly and distinctly. So that, through that electoral politics, holding elections, you can retain the state power. But suppose there is a change, in the state power. What will happen? Political party A was in state power before the parliamentary election in our country. Political party B snatches away the power through election, democratic system, from the party A. Is it possible that overnight the entire state apparatus will change? What is state apparatus? If you read Marx, police, military, right? Is it possible that those who are actually in the legal system, those who are in the police forces, military forces, they will be sacked, they will lose their jobs? Of course, we find that a few changes are made, alterations are made. One is transferred to another place, fine, but you cannot replace the entire apparatus all of a sudden. That's why he says state apparatus may survive even after the seizure of the state power by a different political party, and it might keep on working for some time as well. So that's why he makes a distinction between state power and state apparatus. And then he says that if we keep this in mind, then I'd like to argue that something needs to be added to the Marxist theory of the state, and that is something else. The next section is titled The State Ideological Apparatuses, and he begins the section by writing thus: what has to be added to the Marxist theory of the state is something else. Here we must advance. I was talking about advancement. This is a term that Althusser has used. Cautiously in a terrain which, in fact, Marxist classics entered long before us. He says that I'm not claiming that what I'm doing is something absolutely new, exclusively new. In bits and pieces, these thoughts were there in the writings of Marx, in some of the classics of Marxism. But I am putting them all together and reorienting them in such a way so that a concrete theory about the functioning of the state apparatuses could be formed. But without having systematized in theoretical form, as I told you, the decisive advances implied by their experiences and procedures. Their experiences and procedures were indeed restricted in the main to the terrain of political practice. This is the gap that he identifies in classical Marxism. And he says that I'm trying to add something. And this is my addition, and that's how I'm trying to advance Marxism, and I'm trying to raise it to the level of theory as such from the level of descriptive theory. And this is where he says that I should like to attempt a very schematic outline of this corresponding theory. To that end, I propose the following theses. He proposes a thesis. What is the thesis? In order to advance the theory of the state, it is indispensable to take into account not only the distinction between state power and state apparatus, which he has already done. He has proved that where lies the difference, how one is different from the other, but also another reality which is clearly on the side of the repressive state apparatus, but must not be confused with it. State apparatus is repressive. I've told you that Marx and Engels, they have time and again pointed this out, that state is by nature repressive. So it is related to the repressive state apparatus, another issue, but it's not exactly the same. I shall call this reality by its concept the ideological state apparatuses. Ideological state apparatuses. This is where he talks about the RSA and the ISAs. What are the RSA and what are the ISAs? Remember that when he talks about the repressive state apparatus, he uses the abbreviation in the singular form because he says that there is a kind of a coordination among these institutes which operate as repressive state apparatuses, and that's why no plural but singular, RSA. What are these things? Government. I'm using Althusser here, reading out words from his essay. Government, the administration, the army, the police, the courts, the prisons, etc. And he says that which constitute what I shall in future call the repressive state apparatus. Government, police, army, administration, courts, prisons. Punishment, control and punishment directly. By exercising force, violence. And what are the ideological state apparatuses? Long list. Religious ISA, the system of different churches. I'm reading out from Althusser. The educational ISA, the system of different public and private schools. The family ISA, family also works as an ideological state apparatus. The legal ISA, the political ISA, the political system including the different parties. The trade union ISA, the communication ISAs, press, radio and television, media, etc. The cultural ISA, literature, the arts, sports, etc. These are ideological state apparatuses, and he says that they should be used in plural, ISAs, because that coordination, it's there. They are controlled by ideology, but the kind of centralized mechanism, the government or the head of the state, the prime minister, he controls. In case of the state, the chief minister, he controls directly administration, government, army, police. Sometimes it is said that the courts are also controlled by them, though court has to play an independent role. But a typical Marxist don't admit that also. Anyway, but that is not true in case of family. That is not true in case of a newspaper. Apparently, though, that centralized mechanism is not there. Censorship is there. During emergency, it happened, but different, as I told you, right? And that's why he makes a fundamental difference between RSA and ISAs. What is the difference? That the repressive state apparatus functions by violence, and the ideological state apparatuses function by ideology. But primarily so, this is also something important, predominantly so, primarily by violence, RSA, which is visible. Violence is also there in the functioning of ISAs, but that is invisible. Primarily, ISAs operate by ideology. What is meant by ideology? A set of ideas, basically. A set of ideas, which are formed by, if you go back to that book, German Ideology, which are formed always by the ruling class. The ruling class forms the ideology, and also the ruling class makes the ruled believe in that ideology, makes the ruled take that ideology as his or her own. The bourgeois and the proletariat, these two classes. And of course, there is a continuous struggle between these two classes, clash of ideologies as well. but one ideology becomes the dominant one, creates the hegemony, to use Gramsci. And this is where Althusser is definitely indebted to Gramsci. So that is the ideology. Here, let me also tell you that while defining ideology, Althusser also says, I'll come back to RSA and ISS, the difference between RSA and ISS within 5 minutes or so. But let me just tell you one thing, that Althusser also distinguishes between ideology as a generic concept and ideologies. And he says that ideology as a generic concept is ahistorical. Which is something very interesting. There is a section on ideology in this essay where he says that ideology has no history. Why? Because this is where I have told you that he was indebted to Freud. He says that it is, in a way, omnihistorical, ever present. Like the unconscious mind of Freud. Can you say that the Freudian unconscious has a history? In that sense, he has used Freud, the name of Freud. He has dropped the name of Freud. Unconscious mind is also transhistorical, omnipresent, eternal, and in that sense, it is immutable in form throughout the extent of history. And that is true about ideology. He draws a parallelism between ideology as a concept and the unconscious, the Freudian unconscious as a concept, both omnihistorical, eternal. In fact, he writes also, I'm just reading out a portion. Ideology is eternal, exactly like the unconscious. But ideologies could be the patriarchal ideology, a concrete example. We live through that, could be experienced, felt. And these are ideas which are formed usually in a given time and space by the ruling class. And the proletariat believe in those ideologies, believe in those ideas to be their own ideas. And this is how they come back, the workers come back to the factory gate. Because this is what happens. This is what this ideology operates through. Now I am relating these two concepts. According to Althusser, ideology operates through ideological state apparatuses, mainly, primarily. Primarily. And we forget to revolt, right? Primarily. What does it mean? What does it mean? It means that family ideology, patriarchal ideology. My girl students who are attending the class, they know that so many times you are told not to do this, not to do that. Patriarchy is an institution. Even your mothers and grandmothers might also tell you all these things. You are being brainwashed. হীরক রাজার দেশে সিনেমাটার কথা আমি বলি ছাত্রদের, ছোটদের সিনেমা নয়, এটাকে আলথুজেরিয়ান কনসেপ্ট দিয়ে ব্যাখ্যা করা সম্ভব। Ideological state apparatuses could be seen as an, or are actually objectified in that মগজ ধোলাই যন্ত্র of হীরকের রাজা, সন্তোষ দত্ত যেটা আবিষ্কার করেছে, মগজ ধোলাই যন্ত্র, রাইট? You are brainwashed. And the moment you enter into that machine, you take the ideology of the ruler as your own ideology. You come out and you say, বাকি রাখা খাজনা মোটে ভালো কাজ না। যেই কথা বলবে সেই চাষির বিরুদ্ধে কি আর পাই বরকন্দাজ ব্যবহার করতে হবে? সে স্বেচ্ছায় খাজনা দেবে। The workers will come back to the factory gate on their own the next morning. And this is happening not inside the factory, but outside the factory. Ideology of the ruling class operates through the ideological state apparatuses, media, church. And Althusser says that's why that it is primarily operating by using ideology, ideological state, one ideological state apparatus and all the ideological state apparatuses. But that does not mean that it is not violent. It is also violent. Similarly, RSA is also not completely devoid of ideology, primarily by violence and primarily by ideology. And they are not mutually exclusive. Rather, one can complement and usually does complement the other. হীরক রাজার দেশে সিনেমাটা মনে করে দেখো, সেখানেও তাই, যারা যেতে রাজি হচ্ছে না তাদেরকে পাইক বরকন্দাজ পুলিশ আরএসএ জোর করে নিয়ে গিয়ে ঢোকাচ্ছে। And then Althusser says that during the medieval age, the most influential of all the ideological state apparatuses was the church. It performed the functions of multiple ideological state apparatuses. True, entire life was controlled by the church. He's talking about basically Europe and Christianity. And then he said that in the capitalist system, the most influential ideological state apparatus is the school. Church has been replaced by the school. True, because a child is exposed to the school. Innocent brains are exposed to the teachers. They can mold them the way they like. And that is why after any kind of shift in power, I'm talking of the state power, the first attack usually find is on the syllabus, and that too on the school syllabus, because this is a very important ideological state apparatus. The ISA in the capitalist system, most important one, the most important one. Right? And this is what Althusser says here. And now the question is that, is it possible to, as I told you that some have said that Althusser does not talk about the issue of resistance or the issue of revolution. Now look, whereas this is true, but at the same time, let me also tell you that sometimes he has talked about the possibility of resistance. Let me just read out one paragraph. I have seen some of the great Althusser scholars also criticizing him for not talking about revolution explicitly and read him as a pessimist. I have told you that he was definitely more analytical than revolutionary in his attitude. One of the reasons was that even after the Bolshevik Revolution, he found that capitalism was growing, and he was trying to find out the reasons for that growth of capitalism. I have told you about that, right? One portion from the essay, let me read out for you. I ask the pardon of those teachers who, in dreadful conditions, attempt to turn the few weapons they can find in the history and learning they teach against the ideology, the system, and the practices in which they are trapped. Possible teachers, they can perform this role. I can make you think. I can teach against the ruling ideology. That provision is there. Inside the classroom, the teacher is sovereign. I am guided by a syllabus. But within the syllabus, Althusser is also there. I can talk about Althusser. I can make you aware of the nature of exploitation. And this consciousness is something which is very important. I can make you practice thinking. Ritik Ghotok said, bhavo, bhava, practice karo, which is very important. Very important. Go back to Hirok Rajar Deshe, Udayan Pandit, the role played by Soumitra Chattopadhyay. That's why he becomes the primary target of the Hirok Raja, because he has the potential to subvert this entire system. He is a teacher, thinker. This is why I'm not going to call Althusser absolutely, someone who does not talk about any remedy or issue of resistance. He's not a pessimist in that sense. the last part of my talk. Interpellation. This is something for which Althusser is probably indebted to Lacan and Lacan's notion of subject position, the growth of a human being, how a human being becomes a subject. The essential, it's a post-structuralist notion once again. The notion of a kind of a concrete, coherent self, we do not anymore believe in after post-structuralism. We believe in different subject positions only. And interpellation is the process, Althusser says, by which state power, the ruling class, converts you into a subject. Let me just read out a line from interpellation, that section. He writes, ideology interpellates individuals as subjects. What does it mean? Subject means, as I've told you, it's a challenge to the earlier notion of the coherence of the self. You occupy a subject position in society. Let me give you a very cheap example once again. Think of your classroom. The classroom is always already there. You enter and you occupy a position on a bench. That becomes your subject position. Right. Now, suppose you are sitting on Monday on the bench which is placed at the extreme corner of the classroom, left side corner. From there, the view of the teacher that you'll be having is bound to be different from the view of the teacher that you will have if you sit on a bench which is placed in the extreme right side of the classroom. Two subject positions, two different perspectives, right? So this is something that you need to keep in mind. Subject positions are there. It keeps on changing also. Individual is no more identified as a concrete, knowable, coherent self. Rather the opposite. And Althusser says that interpellation is the process through which ideology creates subjects. Now, what does this mean, interpellation, this term? It means basically hailing, calling out. Althusser gives the example of a police officer while explaining the process of interpellation, right? He says that when a police officer calls you, right? Hey, you there, immediately you respond, yes, sir. This is interpellation. Even inside the class also, if I right now say, Rupam, are you listening to me? He'll respond, yes, sir, I'm listening to you. The moment he responds to my call, he accepts his subject position of a student. This is interpellation. State using ideology keeps on interpellating individuals as subjects. To make them subjects. To make them subject to the rule of the state. To the dominance of the ruling party. But not that it is a true recognition of your own identity. It could be absolutely a false recognition as well. Remember this. This is where also Laka becomes very, very important. I don't have enough time to discuss the influence of Laka on Althusser. That needs a separate class altogether. But once again, almost following Laka, Althusser says that this is a political act and we are always already subjects. Always already subjects. Individuals are always already subjects. Why? Because you are born in a system. As I told you, that think of the classroom. That's why that otherwise silly example I have given you. The classroom is already there. The benches are already there. বর্ষে বর্ষে দলে দলে আসে বিদ্যা মঠতলে কালিদাস রায় ছাত্র দ্বারা. You enter into that system and you occupy a position. The moment you are born in a family, you are born either, don't take it otherwise, as a Brahmin or a Dalit in India, or a Kayastha in India. Your subject position is predetermined, fixed. You are always already a subject, with your birth even. This is what Althusser says, interpolation. You can try to alter that subject position, definitely, but this is a system. Very few people actually do try that. Your identity is marked out. Rohit Vemula, in his suicidal note, wrote this, that I am reduced to a body only. Nobody paid any attention to me as a mind, because he was interpolated as a subject the moment he was born in a Dalit family. This is the Althusserian notion of interpolation. Once again, you might ask, then what is the remedy? How to come out of this? I would say, and this is why Althusser has been criticized so much by some other critics. For instance, a British Marxist whose name is E.M. Thompson, he has criticized Althusser a lot. So many others also have criticized Althusser a lot. But that portion which I have read out, where he's talking about the role of the teacher, because he says that the most significant ideological state apparatus in the capitalist system is the school, and that's why he's underlining the role of the teacher in such a way. That is something which is very important for me as well. This much we can do. It's not possible. Capitalism is such a system that right now it is not possible to subvert this entire system. What you can do is this. You can try to find out the alternatives, even if those attempts are on small scales. A teacher can make his or her students aware of all these things, conscious of all these things. A teacher, to use once again Ritwik Ghatak, can make his students think, practice thinking. Bhavo, bhavo, bhava, practice kar. Thank you. Tanmay is over. More or less, some of the basic things that I wanted to tell them, it's over. Now,
Okay, sir.
questions and other things.
So yes,
Thank you so
so
much.
students, if you have any question, you can ask.
Sir, can we say this interpolation theory of Althusser is also somehow a practice of a kind of practice of Gramsci's hegemonism? And if not, what is the difference?
No. Hegemony, he's definitely absolutely indebted to Gramsci and to Gramsci's thought of hegemony. The ruling class creates the hegemony. Hegemony means the dominance of one particular ideology, basically, to put it in a very simple way. So I have mentioned this. You are not listening to me then with full attention. I have mentioned
No, no,
this.
sir. I am saying that can we correlate interpolation and
Oh,
hegemony?
I mean that hegemony is created through interpolation in a way. This much we can say, right? I mean, they are related, correlated. They are related. Definitely, we can. Of course, we can.
Okay, sir.
Anything else? সব বুঝে গেছে? ছাত্রীদের তরফ থেকে কেউ কোনো প্রশ্নই করলো না। ছাত্ররাই দেখছি বেশি অ্যাক্টিভ। ইয়েস, সহেলি।
Please, sir, say something in short. The difference between descriptive theory and theory as such, it is not clear so much to me.
Anyone from your class, would anyone please do this on my part, if that is clear to you? You can answer the question in Bangla if you want
Sorry,
to.
please
আশিস
ask that.
বুঝেছে? হ্যাঁ, আশিস বলে দাও তো একটু।
না, আমি সহেলির কাছ থেকে আরেকবার প্রশ্নটা শুনতে চাইছি।
ও বলছে ডেসক্রিপটিভ থিওরি আর থিওরি অ্যাজ সাচ এর মধ্যে তফাৎটা আমি কি বলেছি? আমি মানে অ্যালথুসের কি বলেছেন সেটা।
না স্যার, আমার মনে হয় এমনি যেটা থিওরি, সেটা দ্যাট ইজ দ্য অর্গানাইজড অর সিস্টেমেটাইজড অ্যানালাইসিস অফ টেক্সটস অর ইন এ ব্রডার সেন্স দ্য ইনস্টিটিউশন অফ লিটারেচার। বাট
না,
যখন
না, 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 একদম তা না, তা বলিনি আমি। অন্য কেউ যারা শুনেছো, লিটারেচারের ব্যাপারই নেই এর মধ্যে, সেটা বলিনি আমি। আমি অন্য একটা কথা বলেছি। সহেলি ঠিকই, কেউ এটা বুঝতে পারোনি। আমি তো তোমার যখন প্রশ্ন করছিলাম, প্রশ্ন করার সুযোগ জিজ্ঞেস করা উচিত ছিল, একজনও কেউ বুঝতে পারোনি কি ডিফারেন্সটা বলেছি। সহেলি, তুমি কি বুঝেছো একটু শুনি, দেখি। তুমিও বুঝে থাকতে পারো, হয়তো ধরতে পারছো না। একটু বলো তুমি কি বুঝেছো। সহেলি, উড ইউ প্লিজ
স্যার,
ইয়েস।
আপনি একটু বলে দিন না, বলে দিলে ভালো হয়।
আচ্ছা, আবার বলছি, বাংলায় বলি তাহলে। এবার আগেরবার ইংরেজিতে বললাম যখন বুঝতে পারলে, নাকি ইংরেজিতে বলবো সহেলি? I was saying that I was saying that descriptive theory, according to Althusser, is the first phase of any theory, for that matter. Any theory goes through this phase, and it is descriptive. The term descriptive means that it's a theory that can basically describe and analyze a lot of similar situations. Application, right? যেমন নিউটন বললেন যে মাধ্যাকর্ষণ আছে, যে জন্য জিনিস উপরে ছুঁড়লে পৃথিবীতে পড়ে। যে কোনো জায়গায় যাও, এরকম ঘটনা তুমি নিউটনের সূত্র ধরে ব্যাখ্যা করতে পারবে, বা প্রতিটি ক্রিয়ারই সমান ও বিপরীত প্রতিক্রিয়া আছে, ব্যাখ্যা করতে পারবে। এইখানেই যদি গ্র্যাভিটেশনাল ল সংক্রান্ত ফিজিক্স থেমে থাকতো, তাহলে এটা ডেসক্রিপটিভ থিওরি হতো। তা কি থেকেছে? মাধ্যাকর্ষণ নিয়ে তারপরে কত কত গবেষণা হয়ে গেছে। কোয়ান্টাম ফিজিক্স যা শুরু হয়েছিল যেখানে, সেখানে থেমে থেকেছে কি অ্যাপ্লিকেশন নিয়ে, নাকি আরো এগিয়ে 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 গেছে? জিন, ধরো ডারউইন যখন প্রথম কাজ করলেন এটা নিয়ে, তখন উনি দেখালেন জিনের গঠন এবং নানা রকমের এক্সপেরিমেন্ট করছিলেন। এবং ওই মোটর গাছ নিয়ে, যেন এই ডারউইন বলছি, ওটা কে করেছিলেন মোটর গাছ নিয়ে পরীক্ষাটা, বলো তো, আমি ভুলে যাচ্ছি। মোটর গাছের নিয়ে সায়েন্স। হ্যাঁ,
ম্যান্ডেল,
কে?
জোহান ম্যান্ডেল তো মনে হয় বংশ।
Mendel, yes, not Darwin, it's Mendel. Mendel was Rupam, right you are. Mendel, when he was experimenting with this, সেটা ছিল শুরুয়াত। আজকে কোথায় এসে দাঁড়িয়েছে সেটা? জিন গবেষণা বলছে বেছে বেছে, আমি জানি না তোমার পড়ছো কিনা, বেছে বেছে তোমার জিনের থেকে এমন জিনিসগুলো তুলে নেওয়া হবে যে কেবল ভালো জিনিসগুলো দিয়ে একটা ভালো মানুষ তৈরি করা হবে, এবং সেটা খুব ডেঞ্জারাস।
জিন এডিটিং, যেটা
হ্যাঁ, হ্যাঁ,
জিন এডিটিং, ক্রিসপার টেকনোলজি, ওটাকে তো ফলো
একদম
করা।
জিন এডিটিং। তো ওই মেন্ডেলের জায়গায় কি থেমে আছে নাকি? এবং এটা খুব ডেঞ্জারাস। অনেকে প্রতিবাদ জানাতে শুরু করেছে। এথিক্যাল ডিবেট, ওয়ান এথিক্যাল ডিবেট হ্যাজ বিগান, অলমোস্ট সামথিং লাইক দ্যাট হুইচ উই হ্যাড ইন ফ্র্যাঙ্কেনস্টাইন, দ্যাট ওয়েদার উই শুড গো ফর দিস অর নট। তার কারণ এটা হতেই পারে যে তোমার মনে হলো আমার রংটা কেবল সাদাই হবে, কালো রঙের মানুষদের আমরা সহ্য করতে পারছি না। পৃথিবীতে একটু বোকা, আমি কদিন একটা কবিতা লিখেছি যে একটু একটু বোকা হওয়া, সরল লোক না থাকলে পৃথিবীতে চলবে? সবাই ঝকঝকে স্মার্ট, প্রচন্ড বুদ্ধিমান, কোন পৃথিবী সেটা? কিন্তু এইখানে গিয়ে পৌঁছেছে জিন এডিটিং। So the science about gene, or the theories about gene, when researches began, that theory was in a descriptive state, but it has not remained there. It has advanced through further research work to become theory as such. This has not happened in Marxism. সেই একই কথা, থোর বড়ি খাড়া খাড়া বড়ি, তোর মার্ক্সের কথাই আমরা বলে চলেছি, উনি এই বলেছেন, উনি, যেটাকে আমি বলছিলাম গুরুবাদ। এইবার দেখলাম যে না, তার চেয়ে আলাদা কিছু অ্যালথুসের চেষ্টা করছেন। উনি বলছেন আমি অ্যাডভান্সমেন্ট করব, এবং সেটা কি, এই আইএসএস, এটার কথা এত স্পষ্ট করে সেটা উনি বললেন। এখানে ওখানে একটু ছিল, কিন্তু এত কংক্রিট ওয়েতে ছিল না। দ্যাট ইজ ট্রু। এবার বুঝতে পারলে সহেলি?
হ্যাঁ স্যার, বোঝা গেছে।
তো আগের বার
মানে
কেন বোঝা গেল না?
খুব প্রথমটা বুঝতে পারছিলাম না, যে প্রথম বলছিলেন আপনি যে ফার্স্ট ফেজ অফ থিওরি, তারপর
যে
মানে
কোনো
বললেন
থিওরি, যে কোনো থিওরিকে এই প্রথম
থিওরি, কিন্তু
আমি বলি ফার্স্ট ফেজ অফ থিওরি আমি বলিনি, অ্যালথুজার বলেছেন। আজকে একটা কথাও আমি বলিনি, কিন্তু প্লিজ ডোন্ট থিঙ্ক দ্যাট অংশুমান কর ইজ সেইং অল দিস থিংস। আই হ্যাভ অনলি ইন্টারপ্রেটেড অ্যালথুজার টু ইউ। আমার কথা আমি ওটাই বলেছি যে অ্যালথুজারকে যারা স্ট্রাকচারালিস্ট মার্কসিস্ট বলেন, আমি তাদের সঙ্গে সম্পূর্ণ একমত নই। কেন নই তার আশা করি এতক্ষণে তোমরা কারণগুলো বুঝতে পেরেছো। কোথায় কোথায় আমি ওর পোস্ট স্ট্রাকচারালিস্টের সঙ্গে নেগোসিয়েশনের পয়েন্টস গুলোকে দেখাচ্ছিলাম।
হ্যাঁ, তারপর যেটা বললেন যে ইট নিডস টু অ্যাডভান্স দ্য থিওরি, এইখান থেকে মানে থিওরি অ্যাজ সাচটাকে আমি করতে পারছিলাম না।
এই যে অ্যাডভান্সমেন্ট হয়েছে, জিনের উদাহরণটা যেটা দিলাম, পরিষ্কার একদম হলো। এবার হলো তো, না হলো না?
হ্যাঁ স্যার, একদম একদম, থ্যাংক ইউ স্যার।
ওকে, দেখো আমি 20টা ক্লাসে যা পড়াই সেটা তোমাদের 1.5 ঘন্টায় পড়িয়েছি। 1.5 ঘন্টা একটু বেশি সময়, অনেক কিছু আমি বলতে পারিনি। হ্যাঁ, বলা সম্ভব হয়নি। ইডিওলজির সঙ্গে লিটারেচারের রিলেশনশিপ, ইডিওলজিকে কেন উনি বলছেন যে রিপ্রেজেন্টেশন, এগুলো আর বলা হলো না, টাইম নেই। নিজেরা একটু তবে আশা করি একটা ধারণা তোমাদের করে দেওয়া গেছে। আর কার কোনো প্রশ্ন? বাকি সবাই বুঝে গেছে সব কিছু, একদম পরিষ্কার, কোথাও অস্বচ্ছতা নেই। আমি কিন্তু প্রশ্ন জিজ্ঞেস করলে কিচ্ছু মনে করবো না, এটুকু মাথায় রেখো। জিজ্ঞেস করাটাই বরং ভালো, তাই না?
স্যার অভয় দিচ্ছেন, তোমরা চাইলে প্রশ্ন করতে পারো রিলেটেড।
পরে আপনাকে ফোন করছি। হ্যাঁ, এটা কলেজে। ইয়েস, absolutely. And if you want to ask me any question in Bangla, you are welcome. Language should not be the barrier. তার কারণ হচ্ছে যে বোঝাটা খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট থিওরির ক্ষেত্রে। তাহলে আমি ধরে নিচ্ছি সবাই সবকিছু বুঝে গেছো ঠিকঠাক, তাই তো? ওকে, then it's over from my side. Tanmoy, over to you.
Okay, Dada. Thank you, Dada. So as they don't have any question right now, so if they have questions later on, so I will definitely pass them to you, and and know that you are always there to meet their questions.
I'm always
So, Dada,
actually. Don't worry.
so we will end the session now. I request Dilip Bera, PG third sem student, to give the formal vote of thanks to Angshuman sir.
That is
Dilip.
okay.
So thank you very much. Most of the time, we are the students. We try to finding out the authentic lecture on a particular topic, but it was impossible to find out these types of informative lecture on YouTube. There are lots of lectures on YouTube available there. But I watched lots of lecture on YouTube. Uh,
On
Most of the
Althusser.
time,
On
I
Althusser.
felt that it was not a concrete.
Dilip, on Althusser, I don't watch YouTube lectures because I don't know whether I should tell you this or not, because anybody can upload anything. Social media is not the right
It,
platform. Meaning, if you are listening to a very authentic scholar talking on Althusser, then listen to him. That will be definitely of some benefits to you. কিন্তু যে কেউ একটা কিছু বলে দিল আর সেটা তুমি শুনতে থাকলে ভুল ভালো বলতে পারে, কিন্তু সেটা একটা বিপদ আছে। কিন্তু দিলীপ, বুঝেছো তো, ইউটিউবের উপরে খুব বেশি ডিপেন্ড করো না।
Of course, sir. So that's why it is very beneficial to us. And of course, we are very much grateful among us with you. And of course, sir, it was very beneficial for us. So Marxism, what is Marxism? What is the difference between the um, uh, um, uh, ideological state apparatus and the repressive state apparatus? And of course, the more about the how do you use this concept on literature?
Okay, thank you, Dilip. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
So, Tanmay, I'm leaving the.
Okay, Dada. So we can end the session here. Okay, thank you once again.
Thank you, sir.
You are welcome.
Thank you, sir.
You are welcome, Sudeep.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
You are
Thank you,
welcome.
sir.
All of you are welcome. Okay.